Good day, everybody. I hope you are doing very well. I cannot believe we are already in April. When I started recording the training sessions for you this year in February, I thought, okay, there are still so many topics to discuss, so many things that still have to happen. And I'm in April and I'm thinking, whoa, the past 3 months just flew by since Feb to where we are now. But I hope everybody is very well and safe and healthy. And we can really all say quite happy that it's not last year this time, right? But thank you so much once again for joining me for our training session for April 2021. I hope that you're going to enjoy today's session. It's going to be, I always say it's going to be a short session, and then I end up going on a massive tangent on stuff. We know me by now for that. But my planning is to have a quick training session today, a relatively short one, because the topic we're discussing is actually not something that we can have many opinions about. It's actually quite simple and quite straightforward. The Rental Housing Act deals with every single aspect of what we're discussing today. So unfortunately, or fortunately for you, today there's not too much of my own personal opinion. I have a few tips and tricks here and there, but none of my opinion, simply application of the law, especially the Rental Housing Act. So what we're talking about today is inspections and maintenance. And why I'm saying this is a very exciting topic, something that I'm very excited about to discuss in a lot more detail, is this is usually where your problems as a rental agent comes in. It's the inspection before the time. It's the failure of the tenant to attend the exit inspection. It's the landlord that didn't do the ingoing inspection. Now that the tenant vacates, you need to try and prove the kind of damage that was caused to the premises was in fact caused by the tenant. This is what we're going to be discussing today. I have quite a few specific questions that I've picked up from the industry over the past years, and we'll go into a lot of detail about that. So without further ado, let's get going on this. I do have a jam-packed session for us, so I hope you enjoy it, and as soon as technology works with me, I'm ready to start. There we go. Alrighty, so when we talk about maintenance and inspections, I hear a lot of opinions and things like that, and actually the answer to all of this sits in Section 5 of the Rental Housing Act. You'll see I'll touch a little now on Section 4 as well. And then the unfair practice regulations, specifically Regulation 6.1 and Regulation 6.2 when it comes to maintenance. On this topic, please remember, you can download a copy of the Rental Housing Act, of the Rental Housing, the unfair practice regulations, and then the tribunal regulations from SSLR's website under our resources tab. So you have at hand, you're more than welcome to do that. I'll definitely send it out to some of you in advance as well. So you might already have a copy of it. If you don't stress about it. You are welcome to download it afterwards. So let's jump right into it. Here we go, Rental Housing Act. Section 4.2 specifically deals with the tenant's right to have undisturbed use and enjoyment of the premises. Section 4.2 says a tenant has a right during the lease period to privacy, and the landlord may only exercise his or her right of inspection in a reasonable manner after reasonable notice to the tenant. What does this mean? I have seen landlords that want to inspect a property once a month, or whenever a tenant is now not performing the way they should, and they might not be paying rent or whatever the case might be. Yes, that's bad, but our remedy is not to go and irritate the tenant. Our remedy is place the tenant on terms, give him the 20 business days or 7 calendar days, depending on the application of Section 14 of the CPA, to remedy his breach. If he doesn't, we can cancel, we can commence eviction. That's how we deal with problem tenants. A tenant that pays rent diligently, but is known to damage the property. Also, Continuous inspection and almost, I want to use the term invasive inspection, isn't a solution, and actually, to be honest, is a bigger risk for the landlord than anything else. Remember, the landlord has a deposit to deal with when it comes to damage to the property, and that is how we mitigate our damages, and that is our remedy to a claim for damage that was caused to the property, not invasive inspection. The Act allows us two specific inspections. The first one, obviously, our incoming inspection. Second, the outgoing inspection. You can and you may, in terms of your lease agreement, agree to a further inspection prior to renewal. Now, that's something that I do recommend. Before you do a renewal, when the tenant says, when you give your notice 40 to 80 business days prior to the impending termination date, if you then notify the tenant and say, listen, I am more than happy to keep you. You're a well-paying tenant. Everything seems fine. But I need to do an inspection before we do this renewal for two reasons. One, I need to make sure that you are taking good care of the property. And two, I need to see if there's any maintenance obligation that the landlord is responsible for that we might not be aware of because it never came to the landlord's attention. And so a midterm inspection the Act doesn't deal with that. It's not disallowed, but I don't recommend it simply because unless it's really necessary, I can't see a legal justification for doing a midterm inspection. Incoming inspection, definitely, Act allows for it and requests it. Exit inspection as well. And an inspection on renewal, I can see why we want to do that, and I do recommend that. But let's look at the Act. What do we say? The landlord and the tenant must jointly inspect the property before the tenant moves in to the dwelling. And the reason for this inspection is not to find defects that the landlord will have to repair prior to the tenant taking occupation. Why we're doing this inspection is to record the defects that there might be to the property, so the landlord can't hold the tenant responsible for damage that the tenant didn't even cause. I mean, we've all seen properties, even brand new properties. There isn't something like a property with absolutely no defects. A brand new property, I mean, this is what we do. We do snag lists before we take a transfer of a property in, let's say, a new development. There are always some defects. It would be brilliant if there isn't, but somewhere the silicone isn't going to be perfect. Somewhere there's going to be a squeaky door, and there isn't such a thing as a perfect property. So, and if there is, I apologies to that one outlier property, but for all other properties, we need to record the defects so the landlord can't hold the tenant responsible for existing defects at the time of the tenant taking occupation. You will see in terms of the TPN leaseback lease, we specifically say that this inspection that is being done, that was done, is simply there, and the inspection list is simply a recordal, a mere recordal of the damage. It's not a list of repairs that the landlord has to do. Go have a look at your lease agreement, make sure that it clearly states that this is a mere recordal and nothing else. If you create the impression during the inspection that the landlord will attend to those repairs that was pointed out during the inspection, you could very well end up in a situation where the tenant is going to hold the landlord responsible for those repairs, where it's not even a landlord's responsibility. So be very careful when you do the inspection, especially as the agent on behalf of the landlord. If you walk through the property and you see there's a crack in the wall or whatever, to say something like, yes, I will talk to the landlord, I am sure he would be happy to fix that, is the riskiest thing you can say. Rather just record. If the tenant has any specific issues that would affect the habitability or the beneficial occupation of the property. Yes, bring it to the attention of the landlord and obtain instruction before advising the tenant that the landlord will attend to those particular repairs. Then we're dealing with the exit inspection. So section 5(3)(f) says, at the expiration of the lease, the landlord and the tenant, again, please note, in terms of the Rental Housing Act, they all only talk about the landlord and the tenant. No mention of an agent is made in the Rental Housing Act, not because agents aren't allowed in terms of the Rental Housing Act, because the Rental Housing Act deals with the landlord and the tenant. The agent simply acts on behalf of the landlord and not instead of the landlord. So it's not a power of attorney, it's a mandate. This is why we don't see the term agent. So remember, when we say landlord in terms of your lease agreement, the agent should also be defined. The landlord should also be defined in such a way to include the agent as the landlord acting on behalf of the landlord. So at the expiration of the lease agreement, the landlord and the tenant must arrange a joint inspection of the dwelling at a mutually convenient time to take place within a period of 3 days prior to such expiration, with a view to ascertain if there was any damage caused to the dwelling during the tenant's occupation. Now, this particular section, there's a few things that's important here. The Act requires us to arrange and do the inspection in a time period of 3 days prior to the expiration date. Now, my advice in this is to record the time and the mutually convenient time to do the inspection in writing in a reasonable time period. I prefer more than 3 days to the expiration date, but to do the exit inspection once the tenant is out. I do not necessarily recommend, if it can't, it would still be allowed. Say the tenant moves out on a Sunday for you and the tenant to return on the Monday to do the inspection. But then I want the landlord and the tenant, or the agent on behalf of the landlord and the tenant, to agree to that in writing, because effectively that does fall outside of the ambit of the Act. The intention is not to do it within 3 days prior to the expiration date, and once you hit 12 o'clock the evening of the expiry date, it's done, since you can't do the exit inspection anymore. The reason why the legislature did it like this is to not allow a time period to pass before you do the exit inspection. Why? If there was a leaking tap or a dripping tap or something, a tenant vacates, months later we do the inspection. Now suddenly there was defects caused to the premises while the tenant wasn't there. So was it there before the tenant moved out, or did it happen in the time period that the tenant wasn't there? That's the intention of the legislature, and if you understand it like that, you can, as soon as the tenant vacates, so as soon as they are ready for the truck to leave, you come in and you do the exit inspection with the tenant, accept the keys, and then everybody is happy. But like I said, if it's not practical for you or the tenant on that particular day, it's really okay to do it the day after that, as long as it's close to the expiry date, close enough that there can't be any defects caused with the tenant not being, because we all know how quickly a vacant premises can end up having some weird issues. And as Murphy would have it, we never know when there's going to be some weird leak in a geyser or something silly like that. So rather do that inspection as quickly as possible. But then there's a weird misconception in the industry that this inspection, in terms of section 5(3)(f), so the 3 days prior to the expiration date, is done prior to the expiration date with the intention and the purpose of allowing the tenant time to effect repairs of the premises. Now, this is a major fallacy. It's almost like the 7-day grace period that you can't send a letter of demand. It's absolute, what's the term I'm looking for? Nonsense. And it's not a thing, because look at this. The Act speaks of the entry inspection, then exit inspection, then G, on the expiration of the lease, the landlord may apply such deposit towards the payment of all amounts for which the tenant is liable under the lease or unpaid rent or anything like that, including the reasonable cost of repairing damage to the dwelling during the lease period, and the cost of replacing lost key, balance of deposit may be used for this. So the Act it clearly says the landlord has the right to appoint the contractors at a reasonable cost. You can't get your brother to do it for 15 times the price that another contractor would do it. But the Act doesn't say anything about allowing the tenant to effect the repairs, and even more so, doesn't say anything about the tenant having the right to see 3 quotes and choose the one he chooses. This is the landlord's property, and it's the landlord's prerogative to appoint a contractor and attend to the repairs to his standard and liking. You can't replace crappy taps. I did say that, I'm sorry, it's Latin. You can't replace a bad quality tap with very expensive Tivoli taps and then hold the tenant responsible for the upgrade of your property. You may hold the tenant responsible for the damage caused to the premises by the tenant at a reasonable cost. The tenant has no say in which contractor you use. The tenant has no say in which quote you accept. That is the landlord's prerogative, and you are allowed to do that. The Act does require us to then, once the repairs is done and the deposit is refunded, the money that was used from the deposit for these repairs, the tenant is entitled to see the invoices and receipts, or the Act says receipt, but I like an invoice as well. So the Act simply requires the landlord to do the entry inspection, do the exit inspection, do a comparison, see what damage was caused, appoint the money that was deducted from the deposit. So on this, remember, the intention is not to use the tenant's deposit to do the maintenance of a property. If you had a tenant in a property for 7 years, and now by that time the paint is damaged, it's not the tenant's fault that the paint is damaged. That is wear and tear, fair wear and tear. So your typical every 5-year indoor paint, every 7-year outdoor paint, things like that, is wear and tear and not the tenant's fault. If the tenant moved in on a 3-year-old paint, and it was still pretty decent, the tenant was there only for 1 year, but then when he moved out, there were amazing paintings in crayon by the tenant's 5-year-old. Then the tenant is liable for paint, but not your normal wear and tear paint. I'm bringing this up because this is the reason why the Act wants to see incoming inspection, exit inspection, and why the Act is so clear on fair wear and tear that is for the landlord's account. So let's move to a few discussion points. I think this is the important things. I wanted to show you the portion from the Act on inspections, and after our discussion points, I will quickly show you regulation for 6.1 and 6.2 dealing with the maintenance obligation of the landlord and then also of the tenant. So the parties to the inspection, we've just seen in terms of section 5.3, see that the parties to the inspection is the landlord and the tenant. The agent may act on behalf of the landlord if the agent is duly mandated to do so. You then act on behalf of the landlord and you are not a third party, you are effectively in the shoes of the landlord. This is a pretty impressive mandate to have. What I mean by this is to have a mandate to do the inspection of the landlord. It is your responsibility to ensure that all the defects are properly recorded, because if you miss something in your entry inspection on behalf of the landlord, and there's something not clearly recorded and the tenant does cause damage to the property, there's a very good chance that the landlord can lose his claim against the tenant. And that is your responsibility. And why am I nervous about that? Because that could very much, very well lead to personal liability of an agent. And that's my big thing. I try inspection is a very high risk for liability, because if you're acting on behalf of the landlord and you miss something and he loses a claim, unfortunately, that is potentially grossly negligent. And in that case, even if I draft the best mandate agreement for you, I can with the most amazing indemnity clause, I can't indemnify you. Well, nobody can, against gross negligence. So make sure you do the inspection extremely properly. What happens if we arrange the inspection and somebody doesn't pitch up to the inspection? Okay, so obviously, if the landlord doesn't attend the inspection effectively can't happen. And since we, the agents, acting on behalf of the landlord, please make sure you are there. If the inspection was arranged in writing and you can prove that you've arranged a time specifically for the inspection and the tenant does not attend the inspection, you can attend to the inspection, record all the defects, and the tenant with a copy of that. This is the incoming, the certain time to pick up things that might have been missed in the inspection. My recommendation is practically, if a tenant doesn't arrive for the inspection, maybe see if you can postpone it a little bit, do it a little bit later, and then just make sure that that you try to find a convenient time. The tenant has to move in at some stage. So to postpone it and then quickly do the inspection prior to occupation is a very good idea. But like I said, you can do it without the tenant present. Exit inspection, this happens more often, because very often you have a tenant absconding or that they didn't feel like attending the inspection, and we moved out and then decided, whatever. You can then, once you can show that you had a time and a place, well, obviously a place, the property, a specific date and time on which to do the exit inspection. If the tenant doesn't attend the inspection, you may then proceed to do the inspection without a tenant and just provide him with a copy of the inspection report and the inspection sheet. In this case, I would definitely make sure that I take every single photo I can, maybe even proper video. There are such amazing inspection software out there where you can do a full video recording and you can save it. This is the moment where you're going to do that. I anyway recommend that, even if the tenant and the landlord are both present. I still recommend very proper documentation, photos, videos. And if you take photos, please give it some reference. I've seen photos of cracks, and then it's just like a crack in a wall, but there's no reference. It's just like, here's a wall and there's a crack. It could be a crack this size, or it could be like the entire wall crack. But make sure you record all the defects very properly, but also record do your inspection and take your videos and your photos in such a way that you can give a full view of the property. So you can see, okay, wow, the paint is still nice. You don't only want to record the defects on your incoming inspection, you definitely want to record the non-defects. So if there's a problem later on, you have photos of the curtain rails that are not broken. You have photos of the kitchen cupboards that are in good working order and repair. So when the tenant vacates, you don't only have a list of the defects, you can actually prove all the kitchen cupboards were perfectly fine. It was really you that broke it. That's what you want to achieve with your incoming inspection. So the landlord can't hold the tenant liable for damages that wasn't caused by him. And at the same time, if there was damage caused by the tenant, that you can easily prove that it was in fact caused by the tenant. Interesting question. Can another party attend the inspection on behalf of the tenant? Yes, most definitely. You just need confirmation in writing from the tenant that her sister will attend the inspection on her behalf because she is currently busy packing. Make sure that on that inspection sheet then you do get the tenant's signature. So in writing confirmation that this person will be attending on my behalf, and then the third party attending on behalf of the tenant must sign the inspection sheet, and then the tenant must sign that as well. Not a requirement in law, not a requirement in the act, but trust me, this is the kind of things that go south. There might be an email from the tenant saying, my sister Sarki will be attending the inspection on my behalf. And then 2 years later, when the tenant moves out and you do the inspection comparison, she might just say, I don't even know a Sarki, like that isn't a thing. So please make sure that you do get proof that the tenant agreed to the recordal done by the third party. I prefer the tenant to be in their personal capacity and be there personally, simply because the act says landlord and tenant. Landlord gives mandate to the agent. I would like to see some proper proof that the person inspecting on behalf of the tenant is actually duly authorized by the tenant to do that. But say, for instance, you have a tenant, a disabled tenant. So say, for instance, the tenant is blind. It's very difficult then to do the inspection. And in those circumstances, I would definitely recommend a third party attending the inspection with the tenant. But in most other cases, I prefer the tenant, but it's not non-compliance if there's a third party properly authorized on behalf of the tenant. Third party inspectors on behalf of the agent, on behalf of the tenant, now on behalf of the landlord. I definitely recommend that. There are such amazing companies out there who does have third-party inspectors to do incoming inspections and exit inspections, inspections before you buy a property, things like that. I recommend that simply because as an agent, very often, an inspection is supposed to take an hour to 2 hours, depending obviously on the size of the property. It isn't a quick 15-minute thing. To do a proper, diligent incoming and exit inspection takes a lot of time. You have to open every cupboard, you have to open the drawers, you have to walk through the garden, you have to check if the geyser is working, you have to check the drains, you have to flush every toilet, you have to open every tap. It's a mission. If you have time for that, fantastic, you are more than welcome to do that. But rather appoint a third-party inspector on your behalf instead of doing a rush job. Because the effect of a rush job, an incomplete inspection or no inspection or a bad inspection is so devastating that I would definitely never, ever, ever recommend anybody to rush or sort of wing it through an inspection. You want to do a very careful, long, a very, very, very diligent inspection. So what is the effect of a bad incoming inspection? Well, the Act says if there wasn't a clear recordal that something was not damaged, and there is damage then at the end when the tenant vacates, and you can't prove that the property didn't have that defect. So if you can't show, let's talk about kitchen cupboards. If you can't show that during the incoming inspection, you can prove that the kitchen cupboard was in good working order and repair, you cannot claim those damages from the tenant, even if you walked through that place together and you saw everything is perfect, now you move out, the one door is off, the shelving is swollen, it's an absolute nightmare. Even if you can see that and you know that if you can't prove that, you can't claim it. So to not do an inspection means everything was then in the condition as it is when the tenant vacates. Scary stuff. If you've done an inspection and you can't show that everything was in mint condition, you can't claim those damages from the tenant. A halfly done inspection is as scary as no inspection at all, because if you only record 3 defects, the immediate assumption is that you didn't show and you weren't able to show that the property, the rest of the property, was in a good condition. My point is, the access record the defects. I'm saying to prove your defects and to prove your damage during your exit inspection, you need to be able to show the actual condition of the item at the time of occupation. So be it the paint, be it the cupboard, be it whatever, a drain, whatever, record that it was in good and repaired. It's very, very important. But what is the effect of a missed or incomplete exit inspection? Okay, this is bad. Luckily, it's you can remedy that if you are on it quick enough. So let's say, for instance, you've done the exit inspection and the tenant hid a defect. For instance, you did the inspection prior to the tenant vacating the premises. There was a major hole in the wall, and they were clever enough to hang a nice painting of a lion and a dancer over it. You won't be able to record it then, because the tenant says he's in a hurry, he's waiting for the moving truck to arrive, he has to pack. If you then notice that defect after the tenant vacated, after the exit inspection, you would be able to, if you act quick enough, say, listen, Mr. Tenant, there were more defects found now that you are out. Can we please redo the inspection so we can actually record the damages? If the tenant doesn't agree to that, I'm very happy that you would still be able to hold those damages, deduct those damages from the deposit, and it's to the tenant's proof then to try and claim that money from the landlord, and you will then be able to say, I have tried to do a further inspection. He refused. At the time, there were paintings everywhere. I couldn't see the damage. Take the time to do the inspection properly, and you might be able to still claim that. I'm quite confident. I don't say do this and go for this option, because don't worry, if you do a shoddy job at the exit inspection, you can claim stuff afterwards. I'm saying if there was a blatant attempt from the tenant to hide a defect for the purposes of the exit inspection, I'm very happy that we would still be able to claim that, but try to avoid it as far as you possibly can. What happens if we missed something? Well, in an entry inspection, the tenant will have time to still inform the landlord of that. I will get to that just now in a bit more detail. On an exit inspection, as I said, he will simply turn to the premises later and do the inspection. If the tenant refused to do a further inspection, once you've realized there were hidden items, you anyway have a bit of a problem, and the truth is you anyway probably going to end up in a discussion and a mediation in the tribunal, because the type of tenant that's trying to hide something is probably also the tenant that really wants to get his full deposit back. So that is an outlier case, and it's like, let's call it 1 in 30 cases where that will happen, but we can't unfortunately cater for every situation as it would be a perfect situation. What does fit for human habitation and beneficial occupation mean? In terms of the leaseback lease, we specifically record that during that because of the inspection, because the tenant had the time to do an inspection and really see the property, and then still taking occupation, he agrees that the property is fit for his beneficial occupation. The Rental Housing Act doesn't specifically use the term fit for human habitation, but the unfair regulations does, and it requires that the property has to be fit for human occupation. What is fit for human occupation and what is beneficial occupation? It means that there isn't wires hanging out of the roof. It's a safe place. Remember, a landlord doesn't ever have to provide a tenant with an ECC in residential property unless the lease agreement provides for that. I can't see why a lease agreement would provide for that, because it actually really doesn't make any sense. The landlord, not theoretically, the landlord had a valid ECC at the time of taking transfer, and he only is required by law to do that on specific circumstances, including obviously sale, but not a rental. I've seen tenants in residential properties trying to use the lack of the landlord providing an ECC as a reason to try and cancel the lease agreement. It's not valid unless the lease agreement requires that, and I do not recommend that it does, simply because we don't want to burden the landlord unless he is required to be burdened by law. Once the tenant does the inspection and still takes it correctly, the tenant, by doing so, agreed that the property is fit for his use and occupation. Fit for beneficial occupation means the tenant may take occupation. So yes, the inspection was done. Yes, the keys, you can do your thing, you can take occupation. The fact that the tenant doesn't, and then he leaves the place vacant. So he signed the lease agreement, did the inspection. The day before he moved in, he met the girl of his dreams and he decided to rather move in with her. Don't do that. I'm not the relationship counselor here, but say theoretically that happens. And he never takes occupation for some reason. The inspection was done. It was fit for his beneficial occupation. The property stands vacant for 6 months. There is major damage to the property. Once the tenant then takes occupation, he can't say, I am not responsible for this damage because I wasn't in occupation. Occupation doesn't have to be physically there with your body. Once you've done the inspection, once you've done key handover, it now becomes the tenant's responsibility. If he leaves the place vacant and the geyser starts leaking and we need to redo the flooring, the entire bathroom and all the paint, it's tenant's responsibility because he wasn't in the premises to ensure that these defects these damages does not occur. So it's very important to be aware of this. Then what happens with defects that was recorded during inspection? I mentioned that in the beginning of our conversation, and it's important to be aware that it's a simple recordal. The landlord will only be required to attend to repairs of those defects if the parties specifically agree to that. Now the tenant takes occupation. There was no problem. They've done a full inspection and suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, 3 days later, at the time of the inspection, they've turned on the light and everything worked. Now you realize when he turns it on, it's got a bit of a tweak. You have to move it up and then down and then a little left. And then back. What do we do with that? In most lease agreements, there will be a time period, typically 7 days. This is not, once again, in terms of law, this is in terms of lease agreements, to report further defects to the landlord. We create a time period because as you can do an inspection as diligent as possible, but once you are in a place, you realize, okay, but there might be further defects. We allow that simply again for recordal purposes. It's not, okay, but now I've discovered this issue. Now the landlord has to attend to repair of it. It's simply to say there are further defects that were actually there when I took occupation, and when a tenant vacates, he doesn't have to pay for those repairs because it was effectively not caused by him. If your lease agreement doesn't allow for a specific time period, it concerns me, simply because the tenant can then 3 months later say, oh no, but I've only realized now that the tap is dripping and actually it causes the shower silicone to start peeling off. This is the moment where we realize I'm not a plumber. It's causing some other issues where actually it is a tenant responsibility, because actually what the tenant is doing every time they get out of the shower, they don't get out of the shower properly and they keep kicking the shower door. So you need to give a time period, for instance 7 days, which is clear that the tenant can't cause damage in that time period, which will mean that it remains the responsibility of the landlord. Then we also have damages that's reported much later. So by the time your 7 days time period has passed, after that, if there's then damage, we can, in a very big way, assume it's either fair wear and tear or tenant responsibility. So say, for instance, let's take a stove element. The landlord installed a stove 3 years to the tenant prior to the tenant taking occupation. 3 years on a new stove is still very decent and new, so we can't say it was fair wear and tear if the one plate cracks then. Then it will be tenant responsibility. I will show you unfair practice regulations with something that's typically landlord responsibility, like an oven or a geyser, can become tenant responsibility if it is not typically caused by fair wear and tear. And so landlord responsibility, fair wear and tear, tenant responsibility, on the go defects, short-term consumables, those kind of things, tenant responsibility. So if a defect's reported, you need to have a look at this question. Is it fair wear and tear, or is it a defect or damage that was caused that is not fair wear and tear? So if it was fair wear and tear, landlord responsibility. If it's short-term consumables, defects, those kind of things caused during the subsistence of the lease, it would very well be tenant responsibility. If you have minor versus major defects, the size or the cost of or whatever is very irrelevant to whose responsibility it is. A major thing, a geyser that bursts. A tenant can't do something to cause a geyser to burst unless they do. Unless the tenant got a plumber in and they've changed the temperature of the geyser to 120 degrees because they don't want to wait for a deep bath to run. And in doing so, they damage the element. Now, it can be tenant responsibility. Most of the times, your big things are maintenance or fair wear and tear related. So your minor washer breaking here, a tap not working, a bit of a window latch not working. Those kind of things are deemed to be short-term consumables if it is not fair wear and tear. We are rental agents, or in my case, an attorney. We are not stove experts. We are not plumbers. We are not electricians. We're not window experts. If there's a dispute on, is this fair wear and tear, or is this damage caused due to misuse, get an expert. Don't waste your time on guessing, because guessing is going to lead to a dispute. Dispute is going to end you up in the tribunal. It's going to waste much more time. Get an expert in to determine the kind of damage, to say who caused the damage, and the party then responsible for the damage will also have to pay for the cost of the expert to say where the damage lies. The effects caused during the subsistence of the lease agreement, we've dealt with that in quite a lot of detail now. Fair wear and tear, landlord, short-term consumables and damage due to misuse or excessive use. will always fall on the tenant. There was this weird thing in the old days where people said outside of the property, landlord responsibility, inside tenant, structural landlord, everything else tenant. That's not what the Act says. I don't know where that comes from. The Act is quite clear. Fair wear and tear in comparison to day-to-day defects. If a defect was recorded incorrectly or simply wrong, or it wasn't recorded, it's simple. We deal with that as it happens. If a defect was recorded, for instance, we said a window was cracked. Meanwhile, the window wasn't cracked. The window was actually completely cracked. Oops. And there was, if the wind blew, we knew that thing would blow out. Once again, it's going to put you down on what makes reasonable sense. My favorite term, and you all know this, is logic must dictate. What makes sense in a circumstance? If there's a dispute, get an expert. It is unfortunately the only real and simple way of doing it. Then, when it comes to maintenance, I've dealt with this now in quite a lot of detail, but I just want to show you where I'm getting this. So this is from the Unfair Practice Regulations. Remember, in terms of the Rental Housing Act, we have two sets of unfair practice regulations, one for the relationship between the landlord and the tenant, and then one for the relationship, not for the relationship, for the functioning of the Rental Housing Tribunal. I just want to point out this is responsibilities of the landlord, Regulation 6.1. I only have F2M here because I just want to demonstrate where you get the answers for the specific things. So a landlord is responsible to maintain the common property. Landlord is responsible to maintain the outside of the dwelling, including the walls and the roof. Okay, so somebody probably saw this and then decided this is landlord's responsibility, nothing else. But also maintain electrical, plumbing, sanitary, heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, and an elevator in good order and repair. Repair any damage to the dwelling. It doesn't say to the outside or the structure, it says to the dwelling or common property caused by fair wear and tear. And that's where the answer lies. Anything by fair wear and tear is landlord's responsibility. What is fair wear and tear? Fair wear and tear is the damage and defects that would naturally occur over a certain period of time. In the leaseback lease, I specifically define fair wear and tear, so there's no potential risk of dispute around that. Then the landlord, if there is defects that the landlord is responsible for, I'm on a sub-regulation M there, the landlord has to be responsible for that in terms of the lease agreement. So say, for instance, the lease agreement specifically records, which I do not recommend, but the landlord will be responsible for maintenance of all, to a certain standard, the garden or the carpets. So only if the landlord's responsible for something in terms of the lease agreement and the tenant finds a defect to that, the landlord must repair it within 14 days or any such time period that the parties agree to. Typically, the landlord won't have anything like that other than typical fair wear and tear maintenance. A geyser that bursts, a stove that is 15 years old and it's done now, those kind of things. This is landlord's responsibility. Paint indoors after 5 years. This is not by legislation, this is typically just the sort of time periods that we're looking at. A plumbing system, a toilet after 20 years that's suddenly leaking. This is fair wear and tear, and the landlord is responsible for that, not in terms of the lease agreement, but in terms of legislation. And the landlord must attend to those repairs within 14 days of the tenant informing the landlord of that. And if he does, if the landlord doesn't, the landlord is in breach, and the tenant may place the landlord on terms for that maintenance. Remember, if a landlord doesn't effect maintenance to a property, tenant stops paying rent, and we need to cancel the agreement and commence eviction, and the tenant then takes the matter to the tribunal, there is no moratorium. There is a moratorium there. There's no limitation on the moratorium. There's a moratorium for 3 months where we may not approach a court for the eviction. Very important to be aware of this 14 days that the landlord has to effect the repairs. If he doesn't and the CPA applies, a tenant can then place the landlord on terms, give him 20 business days to repair that, and if he doesn't, the tenant can cancel. Then the cancellation is done not in terms of the CPA, but in terms of the contract. And if you are using the lease agreement based on the leaseback lease, you can have a look and compare the content of clause 21 to clause 24. Clause 21 dealing with the tenant cancelling in terms of the CPA, and clause 24 dealing with the tenant cancelling where landlord is in breach of the terms of the agreement. I just quickly want to show you regulation 62C2J. This is tenant responsibility. Wait a minute. We're seeing exactly the same things here. The tenant under sub-regulation G is responsible to repair and make good all waterborne taps, stoves, locks, handles, and windows where such damage was not caused due to natural causes. What we're saying is, regardless of the thing that needs to be repaired, a roof, a wall, a whatever, if it wasn't fair wear and tear, the tenant will be responsible for something, even where in normal life we would assume it's landlord's responsibility. Electrical, plumbing, sanitary, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, elevators. See, it's exactly the same as when we go back to regulation 6.1 being landlord obligation. So the same words, the same things are used on both sides in the unfair regulation for landlord and tenant. What's the difference? Landlord's responsible for fair wear and tear. Tenant is responsible for on-the-go damage. This was a fun one. I said I'm going to be quick, and once again, I wasn't, because we know me for this by now. But I really hope you enjoyed this session. I really hope I've answered a few questions and saved you from a few potential problems that's going to arise. But if you have any further questions, please feel free to ask me. Or pop me a mail or send me a question on a WhatsApp group, or if we do a Q&A session with you guys, I am more than happy to answer your questions if you have anything specific. If I don't, and I only send you a recording again next month, I hope you will have a lovely month with as little as possible maintenance issues and easy and quick inspections. Please stay safe, and I will see you soon.